Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we're going to talk about burning money. Alright, so this is a question which I've been asked recently in a few interviews, which is, alright Gary, if you were successful in taxing the rich significantly more, what would you do with the money? And I've given this answer in a few interviews, which is kind of me being intentionally controversial, which is to say that if you were to tax the rich significantly more and literally burn the money, you would see a significant increase in living standards. And there's a degree to which I say that to be controversial, but I think I also want to illustrate a really important point, which is that I think it is actually true. If you were to take this money to burn it, you would increase living standards. And the reason for this is, if you were to do this, really significantly tax the rich and burn the money, you would be basically exactly reversing what we did economically as a society during COVID. So the reason I started this channel, for those of you who don't know, the first video we did on this channel was a video called How the Rich Get Rich from COVID-19. It was in June 2020. And that's because it was very clear to me very early on that during COVID, the government would give out an enormous amount of money. That money would end up with rich people, and that would cause a collapse in living standards. I've referenced this video a lot on the channel. If you haven't seen it, you really should go and watch it, because it enabled me at the very beginning of COVID to make a lot of very accurate predictions about what would happen after lockdown, which was that inequality would increase massively, house prices would increase massively, there'd be a big increase in inflation, there'd be a big collapse in living standards, there'd be big increases in stock prices and the gold price. All these things happened basically. Now, at the time, at the very beginning of COVID, to anyone who would have bothered to look and do that analysis, it was actually very obvious early on that an enormous amount of money would flow from the government to the rich. And again, if you want to know how that mechanism works, we'll put the link to the video in the description. The amount of money that went from the government to the rich during COVID, the total government deficit since the beginning of COVID, is £800 billion, which would be enough to give every single adult in the country £16,000 each. So if we make the simplifying assumption that went to the top 5%, obviously it's a little bit more complicated than that, but most of it did end up with the very rich, that would be enough to give the top 5% of adults in the country £320,000 each. Absolutely enormous amount of money. So let's think about what would happen if we were to tax all of these very rich people £320,000 each. That's per adult, right? Not per family, and burn the money. Because I think it's actually really interesting. It helps you understand what has happened and how money works. First of all, it's a massive amount of money. £320,000 per adult is a lot of money, even for rich people. The top 5% is not all super millionaires, right? If we say the top 1%, suddenly we're talking about £1.6 million for everyone in the top 1%. That's a huge amount of money. These guys would straight away, in many cases, well, first thing to say is a lot of these guys have accumulated a huge amount of money and are sitting on the money. So you get rid of that money. Now the government, through the Bank of England, pays them interest on the money. So straight away you collapse government interest payments, which means government deficit disappears and the government doesn't have to do austerity. So number one, austerity finishes. End of austerity. Number two is, in a lot of cases, these guys don't have that cash and they would have to sell assets. Now, one of the biggest things that has changed since COVID is a transfer of assets away from the middle class and towards the rich. The way that you see that as an ordinary family is that if you are young, you can't afford a house, rich people are buying it instead with cash. Or if you are older, your kids can't afford the house because rich people's kids are buying it with cash. So the rich have to start selling assets. They can't all sell them without somebody buying them. So assets transfer back from the government. Assets transfer back from the rich to the middle class. So that inequality decreases, money flows back. The next thing is, because they have to spend an enormous amount of money on tax, they probably have to reduce their spending, which means you will see a significant decrease in inflation. It's a lot of money, £1.6 million. If these guys all stopped spending, you will see inflation collapse down, possibly into negative territory. So the next thing you see is inflation goes negative, which means that the massive price increases we've seen start to reverse. So again, you see a reversal of what happened during COVID. Well, if that inflation collapses, Well, the central bank will have to act because their job is to make sure inflation stays at 2%. So straight away, Bank of England interest rate collapses. It'll be the same if you're in America. Fed interest rate collapses. So assets go back to the middle class, inequality reduces, prices go down, interest rates go down, your mortgage payments go down. Every single one of these, oh, and the government debt goes down, government deficit goes down. Every single one of these is the exact reversal of what happened during COVID. And every single one of these is driving up the living standards of ordinary families in the middle class. The government will have less assets, the government will have less consumption, those assets will go to ordinary families, and that consumption will go to ordinary families, and living standards will significantly increase. So what this highlights for me, the most important thing to understand is at the beginning of COVID, when I said the rich will accumulate an enormous amount of money from the government, a lot of people said, why does that matter? Why does it matter if the rich accumulate money? This is politics of envy. You shouldn't care about the rich being rich. They shouldn't bother you. What underlies this, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what money is. And I think what it is a confusion of money for real resources. Now, if we suddenly magicked up out of thin air a ton of real resources, productive resources, and we gave it to the rich, this would not be a bad thing. Society would become more productive, things would become cheaper, suddenly got loads more stuff now, we can all be richer. But money is not real resources. If you conjure up out of thin air a ton of money, most of this money was printed, and give it to the rich, that does not make society any more productive. Money is not a real resource. Money is not a productive resource. Money is a relative resource. Money is a competitive resource. Money is the resource which we use to determine the distribution of the real resources. So if we give the rich a ton of money and we don't give you a ton of money, they will use that money to take a bigger share of the assets, to take a bigger share of the resources, to outcompete you and your kids for assets and resources. And what you will see is your family losing its share of real resources, government losing its share of real resources, and in many cases, families losing their share of basic essentials like housing, like food, like energy. Money is a relative resource. And this is why when we give a ton of money to the rich and we don't give a ton of money to you, you lose out in terms of real consumption. And what you see is inflation. If we were to reverse that, you would get a bigger share of assets, you would get a bigger share of consumption, and what you would see is deflation. Now, I think this highlights the absurdity and the stupidity of the way we handled COVID. Not that I'm against lockdown. Sometimes people try to say I'm against lockdown. So I don't really have an opinion. I'm not a doctor on these things. We should have recognized from the beginning that it was going to be massive. There was going to be a massive distributional effect. It was going to massively increase inequality and massively decrease living standards. We didn't talk about it. But I should point out, I don't actually support this as a policy. I don't think we should burn the money. I think that would be a quite absurd thing to do with the money. We can use that money, we can distribute directly. This amount of money would be enough to give £16,000 to every adult in the country. Not every household, every adult. So this means if you are an adult, £16,000 to you, to your mum, to your dad, to your brother, to your sister, to your girlfriend, to your boyfriend, to your husband, to your wife, to your kids, if they're over 18, to every single one of your mates. This money could be used to make you much, much, much richer. And once you realise the scale of it, it should be obvious that it is the cause of the decrease in your living standards. And I think what the point I'm trying to make here, the underlying point is, when I talk about taxation of the rich, it is not about politics of envy. It is about the politics of power. It is about the politics of distribution. There is a group in society which is getting rapidly, aggressively richer and is massively increasing its share of assets and wealth and ownership and consumption at the expense of the government and the middle class. It's making the middle class poor, it's making your kids poor, it's going to make your grandkids poor, and it's closing down the welfare state and the government. Listen, taxation is not about envy, taxation is about power. These guys are going to eat you. They're eating you alive, they're going to eat your kids. There is no way to stop them other than taxation policy. You know, when I talk about this and people turn around to me and say, this is politics of envy, I feel like I'm sitting here on a battlefield and there is an army invading that is going to take all of your stuff. And I'm saying maybe we should stop them from doing that. And you're turning around to me and saying, that's politics of envy. There is competition in our society. These guys are getting more powerful, they're getting richer, they're taking your stuff. If you allow them to take all your stuff, you're going to be poor and your kids' lives will be poor. They're not paying taxes, you're paying taxes. That's an unfair system. Raise their taxes, cut your taxes, protect your kids from their kids, allow ordinary families to afford things like housing, to afford things like a decent standard of life. It's the only way to prevent the country from collapsing into poverty. We campaign for it every week here on Gary's Economics. Watch the videos, share the videos, tell your friends, tell your mum. If we reverse it, we can make things better. If we don't, then we can't. I'm going to keep trying. I hope you do too. Thank you. Good luck.